Japanese officers mocked American coward radio coordination. Until it killed their best aces, ultra-hook Lieutenant Saburō Sakai can see the American pilot through his gun sight, close enough to count the rivets on the Wildcat's fuselage. The American breaks left. Calling out grid coordinates Sakai doesn't understand. Then 3 more Wildcats appear from nowhere, already positioned perfectly because they heard those coordinates 2 minutes ago. Sakai's wingman dies before he can process what's happening. The samurai code says individual combat shows a warrior's spirit. The Americans just turned aerial combat into a radio-coordinated slaughter, and Japan's best pilots are learning this lesson exactly once. Chapter 1. The Human Story Meeting Them. Lieutenant Commander Jimmy Thach is 37 years old, which makes him ancient by fighter pilot standards. His pilots call him Old Man, with affection. He's from Pine Bluff, Arkansas, graduated Annapolis in 1927, and spent the Depression years teaching aerial gunnery when the Navy barely had fuel for practice flights. Now, in May 1942, he commands Fighting Squadron 3 off the carrier Yorktown. Thach carries a notebook everywhere, not poetry or letters home, but angles and diagrams. He sketches defensive maneuvers during meals, draws firing solutions on napkins, drives his pilots crazy with geometry. Ensign Daniel Sheedy from Brooklyn watches Thach draw the same weaving pattern for the 5th time that week. "Skipper's gonna wear out his pencil before the Japs wear out their bullets," Sheedy mutters. But they practice the maneuver anyway, because 6 months ago nobody thought the Navy would still exist, and Thach kept them alive through it. The Japanese they'll face include men like Sakai, 26 years old, 64 confirmed kills, a farmer's son who joined the Navy at 16. He can hit a diving target at 500 meters, can feel his Zero respond to thought rather than touch. His wingmen include Hiroyoshi Nishizawa and Toshio Ota. They've flown together since China, developed a fluid combat style that treats 3 aircraft as one organism. They don't need radios to coordinate. They read each other's movements like calligraphy. The world they inhabit. The Yorktown smells like aviation fuel, hot metal, and 3,000 men who haven't had shore leave since Pearl Harbor. Thach's ready room is a cramped space with folding chairs and a blackboard where someone's drawn an extremely unflattering portrait of Admiral King. The pilots sit through briefings in Mae Wests and flight suits, sweating in the South Pacific heat. They play cards, write letters they might not mail, argue about whether Betty Grable or Rita Hayworth belongs on a nose cone. The F4F Wildcat is not a beautiful aircraft. It's stubby, heavy, climbs like a pregnant whale. The cockpit radio crackles with static on good days, howls like a demon on bad ones. But it has one thing most naval fighters don't: a radio that actually works at combat distances, with a frequency set shared across the squadron. You can talk to your wingman. You can call for help and someone might hear you. The Japanese fly A6M Zeros, elegant, lethal, capable of maneuvers that make American pilots weep with envy. They climb faster, turn tighter, have range that shouldn't be physically possible. Their pilots train in a martial tradition that values individual excellence and considers radio coordination a crutch for inferior warriors. Why call for help when you should kill your enemy yourself? Why coordinate when instinct and training make words unnecessary? The build-up intelligence reports filter down through channels. Japanese fleet movements northwest of Midway Island. Carrier groups massing for a decisive battle. The reports mention names now legendary in their brutality. Sakai, Nishizawa, pilots who treat the Zero like an extension of their bodies. The Americans know they're outclassed in aircraft performance. They know Japanese pilot training takes years while the U.S. is graduating kids after months. They know the numbers favor Japan. Thach's notebook fills with a new diagram. He calls it the beam defense. His pilots call it the weave. It looks simple on paper. 2 fighters cover each other by crossing flight paths, so anyone attacking one pilot immediately faces the guns of his wingman. It requires precise coordination, constant communication, and radio discipline that treats frequencies like lifelines. At 5:30 on June 4, 1942, Thach's pilots manned their Wildcats on Yorktown's flight deck. The ready room chatter stops. The blackboard shows heading, altitude, expected contact time. Someone asks if the radios are actually working today. The radio operator gives a thumbs up. Sakai and his squadron launch from Zuikaku, confident in individual skill, skeptical of the American reports claiming radio-coordinated tactics. At 1,000 hours, the two philosophies of aerial combat collide over the Pacific. Chapter 2. The event witnessed reality. The first contact comes as radio chatter, not visual sighting. Bogies bearing 270, Angels 12. Ensign Shidi spots them first, a V formation of zeros. Classic Japanese approach, beautiful and deadly. Thach's voice cuts through the frequency. Fighting 3, execute weave on my mark, maintain intervals, call your targets. Sakai sees the Americans climbing to meet them. 6 Wildcats, arranged in an unusual pattern, pairs separated by precise distances. He signals his wingmen with a hand gesture. They don't need words. They've fought together through 100 engagements. The Wildcats turn to face them, and Sakai smiles behind his oxygen mask. Americans always try to dogfight. Americans always lose. He dives on the nearest Wildcat, closing to 400 meters. The American breaks left, calling out something on his radio. Numbers, coordinates. Sakai ignores it. He's closing for the kill, his finger tightening on the trigger. Then the second Wildcat appears from nowhere, already positioned perfectly across his flight path. The American isn't chasing him. The American is waiting for him. Thach's voice on the radio. Shidi, cross now. Baker, you're clear to engage. The words mean nothing to Sakai, but the execution is devastating. Shidi's Wildcat crosses in front of Sakai's line of attack, forcing Sakai to choose, commit to his target and fly into 50 caliber tracers, or break off and lose the kill. He breaks hard right. His wingman Oda tries to cover him, diving to intercept Shidi. But the Americans anticipated this. Another voice on the radio. I've got the trailer, lead him through. The third pair of Wildcats bracket Oda's dive. He's suddenly facing guns from 2 angles, coordinated through those radio calls that sound like meaningless numbers. Oda dies before he understands the geometry. His Zero trails smoke, spinning into the Pacific. He never called for help because calling for help would dishonor his training. Nishizawa tries the classic Zero advantage, a climbing turn that should put him on a Wildcat's tail. The Wildcat is too heavy, too slow to match the climb. Except the Wildcat pilot isn't trying to match it. He's calling altitudes and headings to his wingman. Coming around to 330, he'll be at your 2 o'clock high in 5 seconds. Nishizawa completes his turn and finds another Wildcat exactly where the radio said he'd be, already lined up, already firing. The 50 caliber rounds tear through his engine cowling. He breaks off, trailing oil, stunned that the Americans predicted his maneuver before he completed it. Sakai rallies his formation, the survivors anyway. 3 zeros lost in the first pass against American pilots they should dominate. He signals another attack, relying on speed and individual skill. The Americans maintain their weave, their radios crackling with constant updates. Bogey high left. I'm extending, come across. Target following, set him up. It sounds like chaos. It's actually orchestrated violence. Every American pilot knows where his wingman is without looking. They communicate threats and responses faster than visual signaling allows. When Sakai commits to an attack, the American pilot he's chasing becomes bait, and the ambush comes from the wingman who is already positioned through radio coordination. The Japanese Zeros are faster, more maneuverable, individually superior. But the Americans fight as a radio-linked organism that processes information and responds collectively. Sakai's pilots are samurai, each one a master. Thach's pilots are a network, each one a node in a tactical system that treats aerial combat as a geometry problem solved through communication. A Zero pilot named Takahashi breaks through the weave through pure skill and aggression. He gets on Shidi's tail, closing for the kill. Shidi's voice, high-pitched with adrenaline. "I've got one stuck on me, can't shake him." In Japanese doctrine, this is where individual prowess wins. Takahashi can already taste the victory. Thach's response is immediate. "Hold course 3 seconds, then brake right on my mark." Shidi holds, every instinct screaming to evade. The radio counts down. 3, 2, mark. Shidi brakes right. Takahashi follows, committed. Thach is already there, positioned through that 3-second warning, his 50 cals raking Takahashi's cockpit. The Zero tumbles into the ocean. Takahashi never understood that the American wasn't fleeing. He was leading Takahashi into a radio-coordinated ambush. The engagement lasts 11 minutes. The Zeros break off, 7 aircraft reduced to 3. The Americans land with empty ammo cans and 1 damaged Wildcat. Shidi's hands shake so badly he can't light his cigarette. Thach fills 3 more notebook pages with radio timing improvements before debriefings even starts. Chapter 3. The Aftermath. What Combat Costs. The Yorktown's flight deck stinks of hydraulic fluid and expended ammunition. Ordnance crews reload the Wildcats while pilots gulp coffee that tastes like fuel and seawater. Shidi keeps replaying Takahashi's Zero tumbling past his cockpit, close enough to see the pilot's face. "He was better than me," Shidi says. "Better pilot, better plane. He should have killed me." Thach's response is quiet. "He was a better individual pilot. You were part of a better system." The distinction seems academic until you count the empty chairs in the Japanese ready rooms. 7 pilots dead, each one representing years of training Japan cannot replace. The Americans lost 1 Wildcat to mechanical failure. 0 pilots killed. The debriefing reveals what the radios captured. Japanese pilots trying to fight as individuals against Americans fighting as a coordinated unit. Every time a Zero committed to an attack, American radios warned the target and positioned the ambush. The Japanese pilots never adapted because they never heard the coordination happening. They died confused, outmaneuvered by pilots in inferior aircraft. Medical doesn't treat physical injuries. The Americans came home intact. But the corpsman notices the shaking hands, the 1,000-yard stares. Shidi throws up in a trash can, adrenaline crash hitting hard. Nobody comments. They've all been there. The Japanese train their pilots to embrace death without fear. The Americans train their pilots to communicate well enough that death becomes someone else's problem. Word spreads through the fleet. Thach's weave works. The radios work. The philosophy works. Fighter squadrons start practicing radio coordination drills. The Japanese, monitoring American frequencies, hear the constant chatter and interpret it as panic, confusion, lack of discipline. Their intelligence reports note with contempt that American pilots rely on radio crutches instead of developing proper skills. 3 days later, Saburō Sakai writes in his personal journal about the engagement. He describes the Americans' strange defensive pattern and notes that they communicated constantly by radio. He doesn't draw the larger conclusion that radios are transforming aerial combat into a team sport where individual excellence becomes irrelevant. He still believes the next engagement will favor the superior pilot. He's wrong, but he won't live long enough to realize how wrong. The strategic context emerges in after-action reports. The Battle of Midway marks the turning point in the Pacific. 4 Japanese carriers sunk, elite pilot cadres decimated. The Japanese trained pilots for years to achieve samurai-level individual mastery. The Americans are graduating pilots after months and linking them with radios that make 3 average pilots more lethal than 3 aces. Japan's pilot training program can't replace losses fast enough. America's radio coordination program means losses stay manageable. Lieutenant Commander Thach receives the Navy Cross. The citation mentions innovative tactics. It doesn't mention that he fundamentally changed how aerial combat works. The radios that won the fight cost $400 each. The Japanese philosophy that lost it was priceless and irreplaceable. Chapter 4. Meaning and Legacy. The lesson takes time to penetrate Japanese naval aviation, and by then, it's too late. They interpret radio coordination as evidence of American cowardice. Pilots too frightened to fight individually, too undisciplined to maintain radio silence. Their analysis misses the point entirely. The Americans aren't scared. They're optimizing. The mathematics are brutal. A Japanese ace takes 3 years to train and represents irreplaceable expertise. An American pilot takes 6 months to train and becomes effective through radio coordination that multiplies average skill into collective lethality. Japan loses pilots faster than they can replace them. America loses pilots slower than they can graduate them. The numbers tell the outcome long before 1945. What endures is the philosophical shift Thach demonstrated over the Pacific that morning. Individual excellence still matters, but organizational excellence matters more. The lone samurai dies to the coordinated squad. The perfectionist ace dies to 3 average pilots who communicate well. Modern aerial combat, hell, modern warfare, traces directly to this realization. Sakai survived the war, one of the few Japanese aces to live through 1945. In his memoir, he writes with respect about American radio tactics, admitting they represented a form of warfare his training never prepared him for. He flew against pilots who were not as skilled individually, but far more dangerous collectively. The admission carries weight. Sakai shot down 64 aircraft. The Americans shot down Japanese aviation as an institution. The Thach weave remains a fundamental defensive maneuver taught to fighter pilots today. But the real legacy isn't the specific tactic. It's the recognition that communication infrastructure can overcome performance disadvantages. The Zero was the better aircraft. The Japanese pilots were the better individuals. They lost to a radio network and pilots trained to use it. In 1942, Japanese officers mocked American pilots for their constant radio chatter, their reliance on coordination, their inability to fight with proper individual spirit. By 1943, they stopped mocking. By 1944, they stopped having enough pilots to mock anyone. The Americans didn't outfight Japan's aces. They built a system that made aces irrelevant. Ensign Shidi survived the war, flew combat missions until 1945, never quite stopped shaking when he thought about Takahashi's Zero tumbling past his cockpit. He named his first son James, after Thach. The radio that saved his life that day sits in a museum in Arkansas. It still crackles with static. It still cost $400. It helped kill an empire that valued individual honor over coordinated effectiveness. And the empire never understood what killed it until the war was over.